This is Restless.
Welcome back to Restless, where Pastor Michael and I have already done the chit-chat for 15 minutes. So we're going to get right into the episode. Isn't that right, Pastor Michael?
That's right. We've had plenty of time to talk about everything from Bitcoin to what we're going to be talking about today.
We're all caught up. We're all caught up. We just left you out of it today. And so the reason we did so is because we actually have a guest joining us, and we're excited for. Tony Arsenal is with us today. Tony graduated from Garden Conwell Theological Seminary with a master's degree in church history and theology. He lives and worships in Canaan, New Hampshire with his wife, Ashley. He's a deacon. He does pulpit supply, and you probably know him as one of the co-hosts of the Reformed Brotherhood podcast. He's also founded the Society of Reformed Podcaster and blogs for the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals at placefortruth.org. Tony, welcome to Restless.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks for having me on, guys.
We are glad you're here. Glad to have one of the hosts of the Reformed Brotherhood with us, where we hear right now we can tune in to hear you talking about a great reset. Isn't that right?
Yes. Yeah. Right now we are working through the book Reset. There's some sort of pun in the title where the S is capitalized that I haven't quite gotten to what that exactly is, but it's by David Murray. It's a real practical book. Jesse and I, Jesse's my brother-in-law and co-host. We like to do book studies because it means we don't have to plan our podcasts as much because we just have like an outline built for us. But this book's great. It's just super practical. It's a little different than what we usually do, but after a year of pandemic living, it's nice to have a little bit of a look at how to de-stress and how to kind of get your mind and body and spirit kind of reset back to a neutral space so you can move forward.
Yeah, well, that's a reset great. In the middle of the Great Reset. Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah. That's great podcasting advice for us as we attempt to build our podcast back better. So, well, we're happy to have you today and just hear about your story of becoming Reformed and hear more about the Society of Reformed Podcasters today. Tony, so why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I actually grew up not in the church. I didn't come to Reformed theology through sort of this quote unquote standard channels for most of the people who are familiar with your show or the people who are tuning in because they're curious about this new Calvinism thing. I actually grew up not going to church. So when I was real young, 4 or 5 years old, my family was a part of a Lutheran church. You guys are from the Midwest. I'm from Minneapolis. There's Lutheran churches everywhere and everybody's a Lutheran. So there wasn't any real solid faith commitment in my family. It was just kind of what we did. And I'm not sure, I don't know all of the details, but there was a church riff conflict of some sort. And my mom was just not having any of it. And so from the time I was about 6 to the time that I was probably about 14, I just wasn't involved in church. I wasn't antagonistic towards the faith. I wasn't, any particularly grave sinner. It just wasn't part of my life. And when I was maybe 13 or 14, a couple of my friends from school were starting to get involved in their respective churches. One of them was a Baptist, so he was involved in like Awana and Bible camp. One of them was part of a Lutheran church, so he was starting to get involved in confirmation. And I was invited actually to join my friend James on a bicycle trip to go play soccer. And then when I got to the soccer game, he was like, surprise, it's Bible study. And we were on bikes. So what was I going to do? I couldn't turn around and bike home, 9 miles or whatever it was by myself. And he's like, but don't worry, we're going to play soccer after Bible study. And most of the time, I wish that I could say like the Holy Spirit descended and I was speaking in tongues and all of that. But really what happened was there was a girl there that I thought was pretty cute. And I thought I could get to know her a little better if I also went to this confirmation thing. And so I joined up, and part of the requirements for this confirmation process was attending a certain number of youth conferences or summer camp experiences. They wanted you to have kind of these experiential moments, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it was actually probably a good thing to sort of force people to participate in these sort of high impact events. And to be fair to that church, there was lots of good Bible teaching, lots of good kind of day in, day out ministry going on that supplemented that. And that was definitely not the most important thing, but they did think it was important. And I went to a youth conference called Acquire the Fire, which was one of those big kind of Billy Graham, Charles Finney style revival things. And I gave my life to Jesus. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was doing it to impress a girl, that same girl actually. And the next morning when I woke up, I sort of suddenly realized that the things that I normally thought were okay, the language I would use, the way that I would think about girls in particular, the jokes that I used to think were funny, all of a sudden I just didn't really think, I was kind of disgusted by them all of a sudden. I didn't have the theological framework to understand what was going on. But looking back at it, it was pretty clear that God had regenerated me, and that my faith commitment, even though I didn't understand what I was doing, that repentance was genuine. And so the Holy Spirit used that event and those sinful impulses to then bring something out of it, which I think more often than not is actually what happens. So flash forward, maybe 4 or 5 years, I'm going to college. And I started to realize, I went to a small school called Bethel University, which is right in Minneapolis. It's a liberal arts Christian school. And I was doing initially a youth ministry degree. And then I was going on and I had stopped doing that. And I went on to a biblical studies degree there. I started to realize that the theology that I held, although I had certain things in common with the Lutheran church that I was still a part of, the theology that I held didn't fit in quite the same way as most other people's. And so as I started to study theology, I remember real distinctly, I was in intro to theology class, which I was a transfer student, so I was a little older than the rest of the class, but the teacher started talking about, this is what Arminianism is, this is what Calvinism is. And she said, all right, everybody in the room who thinks you're an Arminian, raise your hand. And the entire room's hand went up. And she said, okay, anybody think they're a Calvinist? And she kind of said it like a joke, because this was a General Baptist school. It was very Arminian in theology. And I kind of sheepishly, maybe not so sheepishly, maybe I was already in my cage stage and didn't know it, but I kind of sheepishly raised my hand. I said, I think that's what I believe. So flash forward another couple of years, I started listening to podcasts. I'm listening to initially things like R.C. Sproul, White Horse Inn. And then I get into, this period of time right after I graduated from school, but before I started seminary. And I find this show called the Reform Forum. And I started listening to it. And I realized that this Westminster Confession of Faith thing that they're talking about, that just describes what I believe. Like, I didn't think there was anything groundbreaking or revolutionary about it. So as I started to read the Westminster Confession, there was still some of the things I had been taught in my Lutheran days, which it was kind of a weird Lutheran dispensational church, Lutheran Pentecostal dispensational megachurch. There was some hangovers from that took a little while to sort of fall out of the way. I remember writing a paper in college that was very dispensational, a very dispensational take on the Book of Revelation. But as I studied the Westminster Confession, and then as I got into seminary and I read Calvin's Institutes for the first time, I was sort of struck time and time again. And it's hard to say this without sounding almost a little arrogant, but I was unsurprised by what these people were saying. It was like, this is just what the Bible teaches. And I realized that I was independently from my own, independently in air quotes, nothing we do in theology is ever truly independent, but independently from reading the classic Reformed sources, which I hadn't done, I had come to all the same conclusions that these classic Reformed sources had come to. And I actually still run into that, where I hold a position that I'm not exactly 100% sure where it comes from. But then as I start to dig into the Westminster Shorter Catechism or whatever it is I'm looking at, I realize like, oh yeah, they were already there, 300 years ago. So through the process of this, though, as I'm coming into this understanding of what the Bible teaches, and I'm starting to separate myself theologically, although not institutionally, from places like my former church and my my college, I'm separating theologically from them. I'm starting to hear about people like Matt Chandler. And I grew up in Minneapolis, and I had only ever heard the name John Piper. But I'm starting to hear about these. And as people learn about my theology and they start to understand that I'm Reformed or a Calvinist, they start to be like, oh yeah, like John Piper. And I'm like, well, I mean, I guess I don't know much about John Piper, but I'll listen to a couple of the sermons. And it's funny because I think those of us who either are coming out of this new Calvinism or the rare bird like me, who I think never really was part of it, but was sort of in around it, I think sometimes we have a tendency to look at some of those people that were part of it and sort of chuckle like, oh yeah, that's just Matt Chandler. But I'll never forget the first time someone said, yeah, you got to check out this Matt Chandler guy. I think you probably really like him. And the first sermon series I ever heard him preach was called The Great Cause. And it's one of the finest sermon series I've ever heard. That is just a sort of basic, starting with total depravity and working its way through God's sovereign election and sovereign regeneration and sovereign salvation. It's one of the finest sermon series I've ever heard. I still go back and listen to that sermon series every year because of how good it is, just in terms of really good, solid, biblical, reformed-ish preaching. There's obviously a lot more that comes on top of what it means to be reformed, and we'll get to that. But that sermon, there's nothing wrong with that sermon series. There's zero things that I would change or criticize about that in terms of the theology he presents. Yeah. And so I'm starting to hear about these other figures. And then I get involved in the Reform Pub, and I'm listening to the Reform Pubcast. Eventually I became an admin in the Reform Pub, and I did that for a couple years. And so I'm a strange figure. I don't know if I want to call myself a figure. I'm a strange person in that I was involved in a lot of these young Reform Restless things, but I was never really part of the young Reform Restless movement, or at least I didn't come into Reformed theology through those channels. And I think
until sorry. I was just going to say, until you mentioned John Piper, yeah, you are obviously we're having another first time with a guest on the show.
Oh man.
You explained your testimony and entrance into the Reformed faith without referencing a single major young restless Reformed thing.
Yeah, I had never heard of any of those people. The closest thing to a young restless Reformed figure that I ever had any interaction with until after I got to seminary and after I had already started to understand that I already believed this theology that was 300 years old and started with John Calvin, was that I used to listen to R.C. Sproul on the radio when I was driving home from work. And that was it. And it's funny because I remember hearing him and at times being really frustrated because I was like, this doesn't seem like what the Bible teaches. And when I look back at it, the things that I picked out that I was like, yeah, that's a little sideways, are the few things that R.C. Sproul departs from the classic Reformed faith on. Mm-hmm. We don't need to get into that. It wasn't a central part of my faith, but that was the closest I ever came to this young restless Reformed thing until I got into seminary and started getting involved in, like I said, the Reform Pub and listening to more of the sort of Reformed podcast 2.0 that I think your show, my show, we're all kind of these descendants of the Reform Pub cast in a number of ways. Until I started getting involved in that, I had never really heard of most of these people. And it's funny because what I did know about John Piper was that he and Greg Boyd were both professors at my college before I was there, and that the school turned into a battleground and people drew up battle lines. And in a lot of ways, we weren't able to talk about things like Calvinism without sort of this chuckle in the background because of what that conflict had done to the school and really the whole area in Minneapolis. So my impressions of John Piper were never, and still, if I'm being really honest, still are not particularly positive, because I sort of saw his ministry on the ground in Minneapolis and just didn't think it was really all that beneficial to the way that I thought church should go.
John Piper and his defenders, we'd love you. Love to have you on.
Yes.
Have you on the show sometime.
Love to have you on the show.
No, I think it is interesting and striking that, one of the main ways you started to come in contact with the new Calvinists was because people were like, oh yeah, you're like all of them, right? They're identifying you as you must be with all of them because you're saying the same kinds of things they say that I don't agree with. And so, it must be a derivative, even though obviously this is the thing that the confessional Reformed guys have always been annoyed with the new Calvinists for. Hey, we've been here for a very long time, right? Whether it be R.C. Sproul, even with his idiosyncrasies, the Reformed Forum has obviously existed a long time. The confessional denominations have obviously in various forms existed since the founding of the American colonies.
Right. And
so there have been ways to access it, and obviously it's biblical teaching.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I think when I first became aware of your show and started listening to it that I think is so important right now is I used to think that other than, I thought I was kind of this weird exception, but I used to think that there was this progression of development. And I think it was because I don't say this to be sort of like grandiose, but I think that the Reform Pub as a Facebook group and the Reform Pubcast as a podcast is so much bigger of a historical thing in the young restless reform movement, and actually I think represent, and I still talk to most of the admins. I'm still good friends with most of them. I'm not a part of it anymore, but I've got no ill feelings towards the pub or the pubcast or Les or any of that. But I'm starting to realize that show, if you listen to that backlog, you see this journey of Les and Tanner going from just total raging cage stage young restless reform Calvinists to like, and I say this with love. I haven't talked to Tanner in a while, but I love Tanner to death. Sort of crotchety old Scottish Presbyterian at the end of this, and Les is right there too, like hardcore regulative principle. I think Tanner is like exclusive psalmody, a cappella only. Like you see this progression out of the young restless movement into a robust, like really, really historic confessional theology. And that's a microcosm that then everyone who's listening to the show sort of follows along on that journey. And the Reform Pub as a whole follows along on that journey. I think it's much bigger. It'd be really interesting for you guys to do a show. I think you totally should, really looking at, I think what I should do is I should get a hold of like Sarah Koenig from Serial and have her do like a deep dive historical narrative podcast on the Reformed Pubcast. But
yeah,
I think it's such a bigger deal in the Reformed movement, the young restless reform movement, and kind of what's going on now than anybody realized. And so being a part of that, I thought that this was just the natural progression of things and that I just was the oddball out who didn't do it that way. But I'm starting to realize, largely through your show, young reform restless theology is not just an early stage of development of confessional reform theology. It shares affinities. There's things that overlap for sure, but it very much is its own theological thing with very distinct things that mark it apart and set it apart from classic reform theology. And actually the hermeneutic of young restless reform theology, New Calvinism, is totally different than the historic reformed hermeneutic. And that's why I think in some particular areas it comes to such different conclusions.
Yeah, for many, I mean, like us, this was a stepping stone toward a more confessional, more robust reformed theology. And I know when we had Les on the show, I don't know how long ago now, a couple months ago maybe, and he basically said, yeah, like the story arc of the Reformed Pubcast is us moving from this kind of new cage stage all the way to a more confessional spot. And that was kind of like this picture of what that movement was like. But one of the reasons that we even decided to start this show in the first place was because we happen to have a lot of different contacts that we know, whether in person or online, who like they stepped onto the YRR New Calvinism and then they stopped.
Right.
And we want to say, no, come on, like, come join us. Like the way I often have been talking about, New Calvinism in general is like, you've been living out in the garage of Christianity. And then you find out that there's like, you can open this door and you walk into a mud room and it's like slightly heated. And you're like, wait a minute, there's more than like what was out here. And you come into the mud room and you're like, no way. And you're trying to tell everybody in the garage, you need to get in here. There's like a whole nother room in here. And then we're standing at the other door and saying, hey, guess what? There's a whole house. Come on in. Like there's tons of rooms and there's a dining room and there's a fridge full of food and there's places you can sleep. And like, this will affect the whole of your life, not just these small little areas. Come on in, enjoy. And they're like, no, we got to make sure everybody knows there's a mud room. Right. And it's like, no, come on, like keep coming. There's so much more for you.
Yeah. I think that's a great analogy. And it really is true. And that's, this phenomenon of the cage stage. If I had gumption to do like another set of college degrees, I would do a sociology degree just specifically to look at this phenomena even more, because although the Young Restless Reform movement is in many ways kind of petered out, and it sort of isn't really got any vitality to it, the after effects of it are still really there. And the people who sort of stalled out, like I said, I'm convinced now that it's a totally distinct theological movement, but it's undeniable that there is a clear kind of logical progression that people go through on their way to Reformed theology. If they came in, evangelicalism, Young Reform Restless, which is just sort of like evangelicalism with like a shot of Calvinism, and then now all of a sudden you get to like a full Reformed confessional theology. It's a clear progression. But I think what happens with a lot of these people that stalled out, and it's based on this movement and this energy and this youth culture, and now that a lot of that is sort of died out, they're almost like orphans. Like they don't know where to go and they don't know how to get there. And that's why I think shows like this are so important, is because we still need to be able to give a pathway to people who want to continue to grow. Maybe people will think this is arrogant to say, and I guess I don't care, but Reformed theology is the most biblical, fullest expression of Christian theology there is. It simply is. And we would be doing the rest of the Christian world, and especially those who are kind of like one foot in the door, we'd be doing them a terrible disservice if we just left them there. And I think, I have lots of friends online that are Lutherans and Baptists, and my wife's a Baptist. I'm part of a Baptist church. I've got no hate for Reformed Baptists. But if we were to leave people in that space, right, leave them in the garage and not tell them that there's a full house where they can come and have a feast and sleep and enjoy each other's company, then like that's sort of a form of hatred that I don't think that we should do. So when we look at where things are in the world of Reformed theology and the YIR orbit, there's a lot of people that are just sort of like stranded out there and don't know how to get to where they're going next.
Yeah, I think that was one of the big takeaways from the interview we did with Brad Vermerlen, where he discussed that when I asked, like, is New Calvinism gone? He said, yeah, but there are a lot of New Calvinists left, right? Mm-hmm. The movement is kind of gone. And he did, of course, say there are people who could do a lot of work on it now. I will say, for me personally, Forum Pub, I'd love you. I'd love to be your Sarah Koenig for you. I just don't know if you can afford me. But I think, another thing that has kind of occurred is, for a lot of folks, it's always interesting because, and this is why I'm sure that the idea of the sociology of these things would be interesting to you, is because for a number of the people, it's, I'm becoming convinced of this, and maybe even they are beginning to read or listen to more robust, more thoroughgoing Reformed theology. And then it's like, yeah, but I still go to my evangelical church, and
right.
and I'm obviously, and I know, I'm sure everyone here would be, we don't want to be like, yeah, get out of your church. Right. And so there become these other pressures where I guess it's just going to be Reformed theology in my heart. Right. Yeah. And I'm going to go to the church where maybe it's a good church and it's just not Reformed. Maybe it's an okay church and I don't, but I think that becomes a factor for a lot of people. And so it's interesting to me that, you are founding the Society of Reformed Podcasters. As you said, you're kind of a derivative of these pubcast things, right. which I totally agree that there was a lot more going on there than just a person saying, there was a Facebook group and two guys who talked about beer. So what are you trying to do with that? Can you just tell us about that?
Yeah. So the Society of Reformed Podcasters started out as a way for, at the time, it was just 3 shows. It was the Reformed Brotherhood, Fast God Stuff, and then a show called the Reformed Outlook. And it was a way for us to collaborate on resources, collaborate on ideas. I was looking at other podcast networks, not so much in the Reformed world. The Reformed Pubcast had a network, but they never did anything with it. And I was looking at it saying, some of the principles that we understand in terms of how the church functions best, in terms of partnerships with other churches, sharing resources, engaging and encouraging each other. Some of those things are just good common grace principles that aren't unique to the church. And so we started this initially as just a way to share those resources and to encourage each other. We went back and forth on names for quite a long time, and where we settled was that this isn't a network of podcasts. It's a it's a network of podcasters. And so there are people in the podcast, in the Society of Reformed Podcasters, that don't have active shows anymore, that aren't actually podcasting anymore. People who've either their show is just sort of faded out, which, something like 70% of podcasts just stop publishing, and there's never like an announcement that it's done. They just don't do it anymore. There's people in there who are on support staff kind of people for the podcast, people who do audio engineering that aren't actually on the mics. And so as this grew, the other thing that I found is it's really, really hard sometimes when you're looking through, I think the last numbers, there's like 1.5 million podcasts. It's really hard to find a podcast that is good, like just from a technical perspective, and then to find a podcast that's good and then also is a solid, sound, doctrinally reformed podcast. You can look up the word reformed in iTunes, and you're going to find the mainstay podcasts, but there's all these other little podcasts that pop up that have really great things to say that didn't have a good way to get their voice out, because getting your podcast out there can be really difficult. And so I think the primary function right now of the Society of Reformed Podcasters is almost like a word of mouth kind of network, where once you come into the network, then all of the other shows, we all listen to each other's shows. We make recommendations about, oh yeah, I was listening to Distilling Theology the other day, or you might be talking with one of our evangelical friends who hasn't quite come to the understanding of the gifts of the Spirit that we believe is biblical. And so you could say, well, Blake and Justin on the Distilling Theology podcast did a whole episode on cessationism, and they were really fair about it. So if you want to listen to a good resource that explains my perspective, here you go. So I think right now that's kind of where we're at, because there's so many bad podcasts out there. And so we're trying to curate a collection of really good doctrinally sound podcasts that don't just live in this really, really niche reformed world, right? I'm Presbyterian by conviction. So, like Reform Forum is it's a network of a bunch of Presbyterians making podcasts, right? We wanted to be something broader than that. And the other thing is, I actually really think that one of the things that's missing in the church is robust Christian dialogue among laypersons. There's not a lot of theological discourse or theological reflection that happens, but between laypersons, even in the Reformed world. Most Christians, even Reformed Christians, go to church on Sunday, and they do family worship, or they read their Bible in the morning, but it's not really like a conversation piece on a regular basis for the majority of Christians in the world. And so part of what we're trying to do too is to demonstrate how to do theology in this way publicly. So we have shows that are pastors or are more formal in nature, but most of our shows are just lay people talking about theology. And, I try to model it with my show. Sometimes we have to talk about controversial subjects. Sometimes we have to say controversial things, but we should be able to say those things in ways that are still winsome and aren't intentionally offensive, intentionally aggressive. We should be able to say even controversial things. Like I compared not wearing a mask, if you know that you could hurt somebody, to an abortion argument. Like there's some very similar arguments that are being made. Not everybody makes that argument, but we should be able to say those in a way and do that kind of conversation in a way that displays Christian charity, Christian love, and kindness, even if we're saying things that are controversial or difficult to say. So I think that's really kind of what we're trying to do, is to foster this almost like a safe podcasting space for you to listen to, where you're going to get good content. That it's easy to find, it's doctrinally sound, it's rooted in the historic confessions, and it's available pretty much anytime you want it.
How many shows are on the society? Or how many active shows is maybe a better way to put it?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I don't even know. I think there's 12. There's 12 shows that are formally a part of the society. I always thought that I was going to do some sort of like rules about how often you had to publish, but life gets crazy and busy, and so right now I think there's 12 shows that we syndicate, maybe 13 now. Most of them are pretty active. There's a few that have kind of faded out. My brother-in-law, Jesse, does a show with the former lead singer and guitar player from Goaty Hook. His name is Conrad. And it's called Fast God Stuff. It's totally hilarious. It's an awesome podcast, but it has such a high production value that they're only able to release an episode like once every couple of months. But those episodes are awesome when they come out. There's a couple, a lot of our guys are seminarians or Bible college students. So, their show output ebbs and flows along with the academic calendar.
Yeah.
So some of the shows are very regular. I don't think Jesse and I have missed a show in like 228 episodes or something like that. Distilling Theology is very regular. But right now we have 12 shows. It's a range of theological perspectives within the historic Reformed tradition. I'm intentionally defining Reformed a little bit broader for the purposes of the network than even I personally would define it for my own purposes. So we kind of look at the Reformed theological world as being Catholic, so ecumenical creeds, Trinity, right? Just Christian, being my brain just left me. Catholic, covenantal, right? So we don't accept shows that would be coming from like a dispensational perspective, even like a John MacArthur Calvinist dispensationalist perspective, or a New Covenant theology, which would be someone like a Tom Schreiner, or a little bit like a John Piper. So we would have someone who's in the 1689 tradition, or the continental or Presbyterian tradition. And then the last piece, we would just want you to be a Protestant. So we would, 5 solas, five points of Calvinism. We intentionally didn't tie it to kind of the confessional rubric, because I think that bar can be a little bit too high for people who are confessional but aren't quite ready to ascribe to every point, every jot and tittle of the confession. Right. Because what I found in the Reform Pub when I was the admin in there, a lot of people would come in there and say they're confessional, and until you start to dig a little bit, they don't realize they haven't even read the whole confession, or they haven't even read a whole catechism. And so in a lot of ways, I think this is something maybe wise for us as confessional people to think about, is when you're having a discussion with someone, sometimes you got to give them a way to save a little bit of face. And so allowing people to say they're confessional and that they believe and support a confession, even though they may not fully understand what that means, allows them to engage in the conversation, to move forward in that theology. Most people would never have any idea until they get slammed in the face by some old staunch cranky Presbyterian like me, that you're not supposed to make pictures of Jesus. Like, you would never encounter that through a casual read of the Bible. You probably would not come to that conclusion without some really deep study. And so giving people that flexibility as they're coming into the network, as they're promulgating the theology that they're teaching on their show, was something that was important to us. And I think it's allowed us to bring shows in that are confessional in spirit, and maybe have a couple things that they're not there. So that's not part of our requirements, but the goal is just to get good Reformed theology in the ears of people who want to hear it. Is really as simple as that.
You're bringing back the memory I had a few years ago, where my wife suddenly walked into our kitchen and said, "Hey, so what's a 2CV?" And and so she was learning about the finding children's resources without the pictures of Jesus. And so, yeah, that's great. Well, tell us a few of the. You can talk about shows in general, or even a few episodes about some subjects that you might think would be helpful to someone. We're always just trying to broaden horizons for ourselves, Michael and I, with the interviews we're doing, and the people who listen with us.
Yeah. On our network, we have this huge variety of shows, and I think it's really hard, especially once a show gets a little bit more long-standing, to go back and listen to the entire back catalog. Jesse and I have done shows on things like the Second Commandment, which is a really interesting situation, because when we first started talking about that, Jesse had not come to those convictions yet. So you get to sort of see him wrestle through that in real time. We've done shows on sort of Reformed soteriology. Very early on, we did a series kind of through all of the main points of systematic theology, which is kind of like the default thing that new Reformed shows do. We've done episodes on sort of current controversies. One of the big ones we come back to time and time again is the eternal functional subordination controversy. That's a mouthful, but it's a view that is extremely prominent among new Calvinists because of how influential people like Wayne Grudem, John Piper, not to so much of a degree. He's a little bit less clear on where he stands on that controversy than others. But because of the prominence of the ESV translation, the ESV Study Bible, and then Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, the EFS controversy is something that's really prominent among young Reform restless Christians. So we've done episodes on that. And then one of our main things we talk about a lot is just kind of classic Christian Trinitarian and Christological theology. Because the other thing that happens with kind of new Calvinists, they come in and all of a sudden they learn about the doctrines of grace, the so-called doctrines of grace, the 5 points of tulip. And that's all there is. That's all they study. Right. That's all they read is the 5 points of Calvinism. And that becomes everything. And, those are important. They're confessional standards. I know that I understand Dort has 6 headings. I get it. But like, those are important confessional commitments that Reformed Christians need to make. But they're way down on the list of important things to learn when you're coming in, in terms of like the pathway of discipleship, getting the Trinity right. The idea of election doesn't make any sense unless you understand how the Father, the Son, and the Spirit have existed eternally. And so you go from things like Trinity that goes into Christology, and then you start to talk about the covenants. I mean, really, like, just follow the direction of the Westminster Catechism and the Westminster Confession. There's a logic there. So we've tried to do shows, maybe not so much intentionally, but we've tried to do shows that bring people along that pathway. And so we try hard to reference the confessions. We try hard to make sure that we're grounding our thought in, or at least constraining our thought, maybe not grounding it, but constraining our thought by the classic Reformed sources that have been given to us. And not always Reformed sources. There's lots of great thinkers and theologians outside of the Reformed tradition. And we shouldn't just go, well, they don't have that Reformed stamp on their forehead, so we should ignore everything they have to say, right? John Wesley got a lot of things wrong, but he got a lot of things right too. So we try hard to make things approachable, to make things more like you'd have just a regular conversation with somebody about theology. It's funny because Jesse and I, we're going to be doing an episode coming up that actually comes out of a conversation we had after we stopped recording. And I'm sure that happens on your shows. You guys talk about stuff during the show, and then all of a sudden, you hit stop on the recording and your conversation continues. You go, we really should do a show about this. So, we're trying to approach things on the ground as they come. There's always something coming down the road. Our show's been dominated by reflections on coronavirus and the 6th commandment and the 5th commandment over the last year. Trying to understand how do we love our neighbors in the middle of a pandemic? What does that look like on the ground? What's the reality of that? So yeah, I mean, there's lots of great shows in the back catalog. I think Steady Anchor podcast, Luke he's been on your show. He's a sharp guy. He puts together these 30-minute, 45-minute episodes that are just these solo shows that are really, really good. And that's hard to do, right? There's the, 3 guys chatting about theology shows that are relatively easy to put together because you just chat with your friends about theology, but putting together a show where you're the show and everything is coming out of your brain, and no safety net, that's hard to do. Mm-hmm. So I think that, all the shows on the network are great. We're always looking for more shows. I'll throw that out there. If you happen to have any listeners who are 1689 Baptists that want to come at it from a real kind of technical academic perspective, reach out to me. We're trying to foster not only existing shows, but new shows, people who want to start podcasts. Because like I said, I think in the history of the church, you hear stories out of the 300s and 400s, right, during the time of the Council of Nicaea, where a person would walk up to a shop to buy a loaf of bread or something, and the person behind the counter would say homoousios or homoiousios, right? And that kind of stuff was really happening. And so the idea that regular, everyday layperson Christians should and can and must have theological conversations is something that I think our modern era has just lost. It's part of being a consumer-driven culture. We want someone to just stuff our faces with stuff. We don't want to do any of the work ourselves. But all throughout the history of the church, this has been a thing. And I think in our context, podcasting is really one of the ways that we do that. Is we have these conversations in public. These conversations drive other conversations. All of a sudden, it's crazy to me, but like I heard about one group that would play clips from the Reformed Brotherhood before their Sunday school class to sort of kick off the conversation about about Micah that they were having, So I don't invest any teaching authority in what I have to say on a podcast, but these kinds of shows, these kinds of things really do start conversations that need to be had in the church that we haven't been having for a long time.
I'm thankful that you came on. We've benefited from, our conversations with various folks from the Society of Reformed Podcasters. So we would recommend, if you get a chance, to go check that out. Where all should they look if they wanted to come check out what all the Society of Reformed Podcasters has?
Yeah, so you can check out the website, which is really just a place to build a feed off of. But if you want to go and look at the shows and browse through it, it's Reformed Podcasts. Make sure you get that S on the end of there, because Reformed Podcast is a weird site. I've been trying to track down the person who owns that domain and purchase it from them, but I have not been able to locate them. So make sure you get that. It's reformpodcasts.com. You can check that out there. A better way to check out what we're doing at the Society of Reformed Podcasters is to just look up Society of Reformed Podcasters in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to what we call the mega feed. It can be a lot, so feel free to just swipe episodes away that you're not interested in. It's not going to hurt our feelings. But that's the full feed of everything that's going on. It's every episode that gets published by any of our shows gets pushed to that feed. And you get the whole range of it. You get it, almost every day we've got a show coming out. So if you want to load up on good Reformed doctrinally sound podcasts, and conversations that for the most part you're not going to have to worry about your kids listening to, we're all adults, so sometimes marital conversations come up in our shows. So we try to be aware of the fact that people listen with their kids and keep it PG-13, which is easy enough to do. But yeah, it's a great way, I think, to just get good content in your ears. There's so many bad podcasts out there, and we like to think that we're providing good podcasts. So check it out. You can also, I haven't been blogging a lot lately, but if you go to placefortruth.org, we've got a couple articles up there. I'm going to be doing a few more, hopefully going to be doing some book reviews there. And then also, check out, I didn't mention it in my bio that I sent you, but I'm also a member and a treasurer for the Evangelical Theological Society. And one thing that I think, maybe to just sort of round this out, one thing that has happened as a response of Reformed people to New Calvinism, like classic Reformed people, is we've sort of evacuated anything having to do with evangelicalism. And so I found that you'll go to an ETS meeting and it's a lot of garbage. It's just a lot of terrible theology, and Reformed theology has sort of left it to its own devices. And so I'm trying to be involved in my own local ETS chapter to then be able to sort of offer that as a corrective. And that goes all the way to being involved on the board, so I can help when I see a paper that's really bad that wants to get presented. I can at least say I have some misgivings about this paper. Here's why. Right down to helping to select speakers. Our regional, hopefully we're able to do our meeting. We're bringing in Mike Horton, and then also presenting papers. So that's not somewhere you're going to find my content too much. I've never published with them or anything, but I would encourage everyone who's classically Reformed to get back involved in some of these evangelical places. Because, we, as I said earlier, if we're going to just leave them out in the garage, that's not a very loving thing to do. We've got this treasure that the difference between Reformed theology and evangelicalism is not the difference in the gospel, right? It's not like these people aren't saved, but it is the difference in saying these people could be experiencing a much more robust, much more soul satisfying version of Christianity. So I would say get involved in
come on into the rest of the house.
We got lots of good food. We got cake.
There's room for beer. The kids. There's a place to play. I mean, this is for the whole family.
Yes. So check it out.
Thanks again, Tony, for coming on the show. Please rate and review this show to help other people find it. If you want to find Tony or any of the other podcasts he mentioned, please check the show notes and we'll share them there. Until next time, see ya.
But
man, my wife just brought me pizza, guys. How awesome is that?
I saw that.
This interview. That's excellent.